The night was supposed to be like any other. The streets were quiet, the air was cool, and life moved on as usual. But for one young girl, everything was about to change in the worst way possible. She was just trying to get home. Sitting in her wheelchair, she rolled down the sidewalk, minding her own business. Her name was Maya, a smart, kind-hearted, and determined 17-year-old who had faced more challenges in her short life than most people could imagine. Born with a disability, she had learned early on that the world wasn't always kind, but she never let that stop her. Then out of nowhere, flashing red and blue lights lit up the night. A police car pulled up beside her, tires screeching as it came to a stop. Before she could even process what was happening, a loud, commanding voice cut through the air. "Hey, you there, stop right now." Maya froze. Confused, she turned to see a police officer stepping out of his car, his face hard and unwelcoming. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a look of authority that made her heart race. She hadn't done anything wrong. Why was he yelling at her? "I said stop," he barked again, stepping closer. His hand hovered near his holster, as if he was preparing for something much worse than a teenage girl in a wheelchair. I'm just going home," Maya stammered, her voice shaky but polite. But the officer didn't care. His eyes were filled with something darker, prejudice, maybe, or a need to assert power. He didn't see a teenager. He didn't see someone who needed help. He only saw what he wanted to see. Within seconds, the situation spiraled. The officer accused her of things that didn't make sense, demanding identification, asking why she was out so late, and ignoring her every attempt to explain. Then, as she reached into her bag to grab her ID, he made a terrible assumption. "Hands where I can see them," he shouted. Before she could even react, before she could even process his words, everything escalated. And in that moment, Maya realized he wasn't listening. He never was. What happened next would shock everyone who saw it. The officer would make a choice that he would regret for the rest of his life. Because just 10 minutes later, everything changed. And that's when karma stepped in. Maya's heart pounded as the officer moved closer, his hand gripping his belt like he was preparing for the worst. But worst of all, his eyes, cold, unfeeling, told her he had already made up his mind about her. It didn't matter that she was in a wheelchair, that she was just a teenager trying to get home. He saw what he wanted to see, and nothing she said would change that. She tried again, her voice shaking. "Please, I'm just reaching for my ID. It's in my bag." The officer didn't back down. His posture stiffened, his fingers twitching with impatience. "I don't care. Keep your hands where I can see them." Maya swallowed hard. She knew she had no choice but to comply, but fear kept her frozen. She had heard stories before, stories about situations like this going horribly wrong, about people who never got the chance to explain themselves. And now she was in one of those stories. A few people on the sidewalk had started to notice. A woman across the street slowed her walk, eyes narrowing in concern. A man nearby pulled out his phone, whispering something to the person next to him. But no one stepped in, at least not yet. The officer glanced around, as if realizing that people were starting to watch. His expression darkened. "What's in the bag?" Maya hesitated, afraid to move even an inch. "Just my wallet, my phone, some books." "You sure about that?" He bent down slightly, lowering himself to her level, but his voice stayed sharp. "Because I don't like being lied to." Maya's breath hitched. She wasn't lying. Why wouldn't he just listen? Tires screeched in the distance, followed by laughter from a group of teenagers a block away. The city carried on, oblivious to what was happening right here. To them, this was just another night. But for Maya, time had slowed down. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing against her chest, every second stretching longer than the last. Then just when she thought things couldn't get worse, the officer reached forward. His hand moved toward her bag without warning. "Wait, don't." Maya barely got the words out before he yanked it from her lap. Her heart dropped. Her phone tumbled out onto the pavement, the screen lighting up with a missed call from her mom. The officer's fingers dug through her things, rough and careless, as if expecting to find something dangerous. And that's when the murmurs around them started growing louder. A man with his phone out took a step closer, his camera clearly recording. The woman across the street crossed her arms, her expression sharp with disapproval. More eyes turned their way, more whispers spread through the crowd. But the officer ignored it all. For now. Maya's hands clenched into fists as she watched the officer rummage through her belongings like she was some kind of criminal. She wanted to speak up, to demand her things back, but fear kept her silent. Her mind raced, trying to figure out what to do next. She knew she had nothing to hide, but that didn't seem to matter. The crowd around them was growing. More people had stopped, their faces a mix of curiosity, concern, and frustration. The man recording took a step closer, his voice firm but controlled. "Hey, officer, what's going on here?" "She's just a kid." The officer barely glanced up. "Back up," he ordered, his tone sharp. "This doesn't concern you." But it did concern them. The tension in the air was thick now, unspoken but undeniable. Maya could feel it pressing against her chest. Her breathing was shaky as she forced herself to speak. "Please, can I just have my bag back? I haven't done anything wrong." The officer finally looked at her, but there was no kindness in his eyes. "That's not up to you," he said flatly, before turning his attention back to the bag. Maya's stomach twisted. How had things gotten so out of control so quickly? Just minutes ago, she was heading home, thinking about what movie she'd watch before bed. Now she was sitting in the middle of the sidewalk, surrounded by strangers, with a police officer treating her like a threat. A few feet away, a woman in a red jacket pulled out her phone and started dialing. "I'm calling someone," she muttered. Maya wasn't sure if she meant another officer or someone else, but either way, it sent a flicker of hope through her. Maybe someone would step in before things got worse. The officer finally pulled his hand out of her bag, holding nothing but her wallet. He flipped it open, his eyes scanning her ID. His jaw tightened. "Maya Thompson," he read aloud, almost like he didn't believe it. Then he looked at her again, studying her face like he was seeing her for the first time. Something changed in his expression. It was subtle, but Maya caught it. A flicker of hesitation. Doubt, maybe. But before she could say anything, another voice cut through the air. "Officer Jacobs." A second officer had arrived, his uniform crisp, his stance calm but authoritative. His eyes darted between Maya, the scattered contents of her bag, and the growing crowd. Then finally, he looked at the officer standing over her. "What's going on here?" The first officer, Jacobs, stiffened. For the first time, he seemed unsure of himself. His grip on Maya's wallet tightened slightly before he shoved it back into her bag. Maya swallowed hard. Was this it? Was this the moment things would turn around? Or was it about to get even worse? Maya held her breath as the second officer stepped forward. The air between them felt electric, charged with unspoken tension. Officer Jacobs, the one who had been searching her bag, seemed different now, like he was second-guessing himself. But he didn't back down. Instead, he squared his shoulders and spoke quickly. "She was acting suspicious," Jacobs said, his voice firm but slightly unsteady. "Didn't comply when I asked her to stop." Maya's pulse pounded in her ears. "That's not true," she said, her voice a little stronger now. I told you I was just trying to get home. The second officer, whose name tag read Carter, studied her carefully. His gaze flickered to the crowd, then to the phone still recording nearby. He knew people were watching. He knew this wasn't just going to disappear. Suspicious how? Officer Carter asked. His tone wasn't aggressive, but it wasn't friendly either. It was the kind of voice that demanded real answers. Jacobs hesitated. Maya saw his fingers twitch at his side, like he was grasping for a response that would justify everything he had just done. He cleared his throat. She was reaching into her bag. I didn't know what she was going for. Carter let out a slow breath, his expression unreadable. Did she tell you she was getting her ID? Jacobs didn't respond right away. And that pause, just a second too long, spoke louder than any words could. The people watching murmured among themselves. Someone whispered, "Unbelievable." The man still holding his phone let out a quiet scoff. "Yeah, we got all that on video." Maya could feel the shift happening. The officer who had been so sure of himself minutes ago was now caught between his actions and the undeniable truth. His face was tense, his jaw clenched tight. "Give her the bag back," Carter said finally, his voice steady. Then finally, he let out a sharp breath and dropped the bag onto Maya's lap. The weight of it hit her legs, but she barely noticed. Her hands shook as she clutched it close to her chest. The second officer turned back to her. "Are you all right?" Maya wanted to say yes. She wanted to nod and pretend this had never happened. But the truth was, she wasn't sure. Her heart was still racing, and her mind replayed everything over and over, like a bad dream she couldn't wake up from. Before she could answer, a voice called out from the crowd. "She deserves an apology." The words hung in the air, undeniable, impossible to ignore. And for the first time, Officer Jacobs looked unsure of everything. Jacobs' face hardened at the demand for an apology. His jaw clenched, and for a moment, it seemed like he was about to say something, maybe push back, maybe defend himself. But he didn't. Instead, he took a small step back, like he was distancing himself from the situation, from the weight of the eyes staring him down. Maya gripped her bag tightly, her fingers trembling slightly. She could still feel the rush of adrenaline in her system, her body on edge, even though the worst of it seemed to be over. But something still felt off. The way Jacob stood there, silent, his hands twitching at his sides, it was like he wasn't done yet. Carter turned back to Maya. His voice was calm, but there was something in his expression that looked like concern. "Do you want to file a report?" Maya hesitated. She hadn't even thought that far ahead. Right now, all she wanted was to go home, to get away from this moment, to forget the way fear had taken hold of her. But before she could even answer, a sharp voice cut through the air. "This is ridiculous." Jacob shook his head, his frustration bubbling over. "I was doing my job." His eyes darted to the people still recording, then to Carter. "You know how it is. You know what happens when we hesitate." Carter's expression darkened, his voice dropping just slightly. "You didn't hesitate. You overreacted." A heavy silence followed. The crowd didn't move. No one spoke. The only sound was the distant hum of traffic, the occasional rustling of someone shifting their weight. The tension was thick, and Jacobs could feel it pressing against him. He glanced around, as if realizing for the first time just how many people were here, how many witnesses had seen everything. Then, just as it seemed like things might settle, a voice crackled through his radio. "Officer Jacobs, we need you back at the station. Now." Jacobs stiffened. Something about the way the voice spoke, firm, direct, leaving no room for argument, made Maya's stomach tighten. Jacobs pressed the radio to his mouth. "Copy that." His voice was steady, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward his car. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't look back. He just left. Maya exhaled, the weight of the moment still pressing down on her. Carter stayed beside her, his expression unreadable. "That was strange," he muttered under his breath. Maya nodded slowly. She didn't know why, but something about the way Jacobs left didn't feel right. It wasn't just frustration. It wasn't just anger. It was something else, something that made her skin crawl. And for the first time since this all started, Maya had the unsettling feeling that this wasn't over. Not even close. Maya sat there, gripping her bag like it was the only thing grounding her. The crowd had started to thin, people murmuring to each other as they walked away, but the energy in the air hadn't settled. Something still felt off. She could see it in Carter's face, too, the way his eyes flickered toward Jacob's car as it disappeared down the street. "I don't like this," he muttered, almost to himself. Maya didn't either. She wanted to believe it was over, that Jacobs had left and wouldn't bother her again, but her gut told her otherwise. There was something about the way he walked off, the way he didn't argue or push back, like he knew something she didn't. Carter exhaled and shook his head. "Do you have someone who can come get you?" Maya nodded, fumbling for her phone. She hadn't even checked it since everything happened. As she unlocked the screen, a chill ran through her. Missed calls, several of them, all from her mom. And a text. Asterisk asterisk, where are you? A police officer came to the house looking for you. Asterisk asterisk. Maya's blood ran cold. Her breath hitched as she read the words again, her brain struggling to make sense of them. Why? Why would Jacobs go to her house? What was he trying to do? Carter must have noticed the change in her expression because he took a step closer. What is it? Maya turned the screen toward him. His face hardened instantly. "That doesn't make sense," he said under his breath. He pulled out his own radio. "Dispatch, do we have any units assigned to an address for Maya Thompson?" A few seconds of static, then a reply. Asterisk asterisk negative, Officer Carter. No units have been dispatched to that location. Asterisk asterisk. Maya's pulse pounded in her ears. That meant Jacobs had gone on his own. Carter's expression turned sharp, his mind clearly racing. "He's trying to cover himself," he said, already moving toward his car. "We need to get there now." Maya didn't even hesitate. She wheeled herself forward, but Carter was already opening the passenger door. "Get in. I'm taking you home." The drive was fast, tense. Maya barely breathed as she gripped her phone, her mind flooded with worst-case scenarios. What if Jacobs was trying to twist the story? What if he was scaring her mom, making it seem like she had done something wrong? As they turned onto her street, her stomach dropped. A police car was parked outside her house. Carter pulled up quickly and was out of the car in seconds. Maya struggled to get out, her heart pounding, her hands shaking as she wheeled herself toward the front door. "I will be," she said finally. Carter gave her a reassuring nod. "If you ever need anything, you have my number." Maya appreciated that. Not all officers were like Jacobs. Some genuinely wanted to do the right thing. She glanced at her mom, then at the front door where Jacobs had just walked out. "People saw what happened," she said. "They recorded it. He can't hide from this." Her mom squeezed her hand. "And you stood your ground." Maya took a deep breath. She had been scared, but she hadn't backed down. And now things were changing. Maybe Jacobs had thought he could silence her, but the truth had spoken louder. As Carter left and the house grew quiet again, Maya knew this was something she'd never forget. But she also knew one thing for sure: she wasn't afraid anymore.